I know that Zeev would be deeply proud to have this year's lecturer with us. Yoav Galant is a soldier strategist who has been in the room when great decisions were made and in the field to carry them out. He started his military career in the Navy and was a decorated naval SEAL and commander. He then moved from sea to land and rose up the ranks of the Army. He served as military advisor to Prime Minister Sharon at critical moments, including disengagement, and then as head of Southern Command, where he led Israeli forces in the Cast-Led operation that restored deterrence to Israel's strategic calculus. He was nominated by the Prime and Defense Ministers to be Chief of Staff of the IDF. His candidacy did not go through, but General Galant continues to be on the cutting edge of Israel's strategic horizons, currently leading an effort to explore and exploit the amazing energy finds off Israel's Mediterranean coast. One of General Galant's pastimes is sea kayaking, which he does off the Caesarea coast. In the turbulent waters of the Middle East, Israel has already benefited from his sure hands, and I'm sure it will continue to do so in the years ahead. First, I'd like to welcome his wife, Claudine, who traveled with General Galant to be here. And ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome to the Institute General Yoav Galant.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Sarah and Adar and Eyal, the Schiff family, dear guests. I feel very privileged to be here, and it's a unique opportunity. First of all, because Zeev Schiff was one of the most, and I would say, the highly regarded and prominent journalists in Israel, especially for military and defense issues. He was well respected by all the different parties and people who knew him. This was, first of all, because he had a tremendous knowledge. Second, because he had the best connections in Israel, in the United States, and in many other places. And more than that, because he was very honest, very humble, and had the greatest integrity that one can have. And for these reasons, I believe that he turned to be not just a journalist, but also a consultant to many of the Israeli prominent generals and politicians. I learned to know Zeev about 15 years ago when I was commanding Gaza Division, and he was directed by the Chief of Staff at that time to talk to me about the situation. I find myself, instead of briefing, being briefed by Zeev about the situation and the general ideas. So for me, it's also an honor to his memory to be here and to talk in front of you. Let me start with a short story that will say some word about the reason I'm here. About 10 or 9 years ago, Prime Minister Sharon was invited, not the first and not the last time, by President George W. Bush to visit the White House. I was escorting him, and at noon we sat for a lunch in the second floor of the White House above the Oval Office. And there were about 10 people in the room. And the mood was very good, and the Prime Minister keep saying every few minutes, listen, Mr. President, you are our greatest friend. And then, listen, Mr. President, you are our best friend. So eventually, the President said to the Prime Minister, Ari, can I ask you a question? I said, sure, why not? He say, tell me, Mr. Prime Minister, who is your second best friend? And there was silence, and then a big laugh. And I'm here to address this speech, but also to tell you that there is a big appreciation and a big respect to the American people, to the support of the Americans in the existence and defense of Israel, and the excellent relationship between the two defense institutions and defense forces. Now I'll try to evaluate together with you the situation in the Middle East. And I'll try to do it the way I know to evaluate things, which means military style. Usually you talk about the arena, the ground, the weather. I'll talk about the arena. Second, you talk about the two different, or more than that, parties that are sharing the problem, which means the enemy and you. Sometimes it's also some friends and the rivals. And third, in military, it's conclusions and the plan. Here, I'll put more question marks for you and for me, and maybe some conclusions. So as to the, I would say, the arena, Albert Einstein was asked once, can you explain the theory of relativity to simple people, to layman people? He said, well, it's very simple. If you are moving from east to west on a ship that is sailing from south to north, where exactly are you heading to? And this is it. At the same time that we are creating our direction to somewhere, the platform underneath us is moving somewhere else. And let me say a few words about few components of this platform. Neither one of them is security per se, but all of them have to do with the national security. And then some other words about the world, and that will summarize what I call the arena. Population. Within about 10 years, we'll have 8 million Jews and 8 million non-Jews on the western side of the Jordan Valley. And from this point and on, the Jews will be a minority. And you know that the state of Israel was established as, I would say, a national preserve for the Jewish people. Because the Jewish people believe, and I think most of the people understand that the Jews gave the greatest values to humanity, like the Bible, and greatest persons like Albert Einstein and Spinoza and Barbara Streisand. And got as a reward diaspora and riots and pogroms and Inquisition, and at the end, the Holocaust. And after the Holocaust, they established the state of Israel. And the idea was that this is the first and only place that the Jews can defend themselves by themselves in their own land. And if you ask me what is the major change from 2,000 years ago to nowadays, is the capability of the Jews to defend themselves by themselves, which means that the tool to carry it out is the IDF. And this is the major difference. The people didn't change too much. There were good people in the diaspora all over the world, and they are still the same people. And this is not a fact, but it's going to be a fact within 10 years, 15 years, or maybe 20 years. Second, the economic situation. The GDP per capita in Israel is about $30,000 a year. In the countries around us, it's in between 5, 10, maybe 15% It's maybe 4,000 in Egypt, 3,000 in Jordan, 3,000 in Syria, 5,000 in Lebanon, 6,000 nowadays in the West Bank, and it's very close to poverty line, maybe $1,000 in Gaza Strip. That means that a guy who is standing in Sderot and look to the other side, to a small village by the name of Bet Hanun, which is less than 1 kilometer apart, see someone who get paid 3 or 4% of his income. In most of the places in the world, it's a good reason to start a war. In Israel, it's only the spices on the Mediterranean shish kebab. That's nothing, because we have other problems. Third point, water. Well, good news and bad news. Good news about the water is that there is enough water in the Middle East. Most of them go to the sea. The Nile, the Tigris, and Euphrates. But there is enough water. They are not divided. Good. Second good news is that you can buy water for money. It will cost you $1 billion for the first billion cubic meters, and then let's say 30 cents per cubic meter. And we are willing to pay $1 per 1 liter when we drink mineral water. So it's acceptable. The bad news is that this is a good reason to fight about. When I was, let's say, a young officer leading commando units across the beach of Lebanon, and it didn't happen yesterday morning, it was, let's say, 30 years ago, at a distance of 1,000 meters offshore, we drink fresh water from the Litani River. This is the dimensions, okay? At the same time, let's say 20 years later, but the Litani water are still spilling to the sea. The Israeli and the Lebanese were arguing and almost fighting about the Wazani sources, which are maybe 5% of the total amount of the Jordan Valley, of the Jordan River, which is smaller, have maybe half of the water of the Litani. So it depends what you do with this issue. The fourth point is the radical Islamic movements. If you will look from above on the Mediterranean, you will see a green carpet. Let's start from for example, from the west side of Africa, the Atlantic. You have Morocco, you have Tunisia, Algeria, Libya, Egypt, then a small white color by the name of Israel, very small, then Jordan, Iraq, Iran, and it depends what direction you go, whether you go to Afghanistan and Pakistan, and eventually you hit a big country with a different color, which is India, or you go to the north, and it takes you a while till you get to Russia. That's the situation. This is the neighborhood we are living in, and it's not the best neighborhood. But this is it. And of course, if you zoom into Israel, you find the Hamas and the Islamic movement inside Israel and on the borders, including, of course, Hezbollah, Shia, and Sunni. The last point in those 5 preconditions, I would say, is the military nuclear capability. When I'm saying that, all of you are thinking, of course, about Iran. But let me remind you a few facts. 30 years ago, Israel bombed a nuclear reactor in Iraq. A few years ago, there were some newspapers that claimed that we did something similar in Syria. The United States and England dismantled 10 years ago the capabilities of Libya with cooperation with Gaddafi, of creating a nuclear bomb. I don't have to say anything about the Pakistanis. You're well aware of it. They blew 7 nuclear bombs devices in order to show the Indians that they have also the capability. That was 15 or 20 years ago. And we are dealing now with the Iranian issue. Taking all these 5 points, you have what I would say the zodiac that the Israeli situation and the Middle East situation is standing on, while this zodiac is moving somewhere. If you zoom out a little bit and look on the global condition, you find, of course, a different world than was exist 30 years ago or 50 years ago. The international economy, productivity, energy, food, transportation, the new blocks of civilization, let's say, according to the ideas of Huntington, that deal for their own interest in different issues in Europe, in Eastern Asia, in other places. The legitimacy to carry out any kind of military or military action or different actions at all, the global media and the different connections between different countries that created the new world that we are facing nowadays. So if I'll try to summarize all this, I would say the conditions, the arena for us, the state of Israel, had been changed dramatically during the last 30 years and definitely during the last 60 or 70 years. Now, a few words about the Middle East and what we are facing nowadays, and I would like to take you for a short odyssey in order to understand what we are facing now. It will be very useful to try to understand the record of the last 100 years in the Middle East. First of all, a dramatic change is creating nowadays in the Middle East. Usually the sources of power in the Arab world were only 2. Either the military, the army, the security organizations, that the ruler, no matter if it's a king, a general, or politicians, were based on, or the radical Islamic movements. And as you well know, when the British and the French divided the area in between them 100 years ago, they created a lot of artificial states, including Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and others. And you can look at on the map and see the sharp lines. And for almost 100 years, on and off, the rulers in these places were based on military power. What we see now is a shift in the power in the region from being based on military power to a power that's based on religious parties. The Muslim Brothers, who were established during the 20s in Egypt, in Pakistan, were sitting on the lines, waiting for their turn. And this turn is, according to them, is about to happen, or is happened. It started 5 years ago, if you remember. Actually, it started in the Shia side 30 years ago in Iran. It happened 5 or 6 years ago in Gaza Strip when Hamas took over. It's Egypt, it's Yemen, it's Tunisia, and we'll talk a little bit about Syria later on. Now, as to the Middle East, we have to remember that 1/3 of the population, about 100 million people are under the age of 18 in the Middle East. They know nothing about victories of Israel in the Six-Day War or in other wars, but they hate Israel for their own purposes and own reason because it's part of their education. And to those of you that will say, well, you predict something that won't happen, let me remind you that 30 years ago, we had excellent relationship, maybe 35 years ago, with the three original and most prominent Arab states or Muslim states in the region: Egypt, Iran, and Turkey. It was for a very short period of time till the collapse of the Shah in Iran. Then we see what's going on in the relationship between us and Turkey, and I really hope that they will get improved. And you are watching closely what's happened in Egypt, and I'll talk about it. Now, let me take you to the Odyssey and the relationship that happened between the Jews and the Palestinians and the Arabs in this region. It took 30 years since the First World War ended till the Independence War, and both sides got ready. After the UN resolution in 1947, a civil war happened between the Israelis and the Palestinians for half a year, till May 1948, and then a war with all the others, all the Arab nations that invented into Israel. Now, why was it that the Jews happened to win in this war? And you know that the estimation in this place, in the Department of Foreign Affairs, was that Israel will not be able to exist. The president rejected it and accept the existence of Israel. I'm talking about Truman, and that the results are well known. But basically what happened was that the Arabs were exhausted. First of all, because they fought the British in 36 to 39 in the Great Arab Rebellion and lost almost all their assets and all their support. Second, because they were split, fragmented, and not organized. Third, they didn't have enough money to support this effort. But they were very brave in the battlefield. Most of the leaders, military leaders, died in the battlefield. Qaugji, Abdel Qadir al-Husseini, Hassan Salama, all of them died in battles. They weren't afraid. They didn't run away from the battlefield. What was it in the Israeli side? The Jews were well organized. The Haganah, the defense organization, was established in the 20s. It was an army to be. There was a government. Even so, there wasn't country, led by Ben-Gurion. There was Ben-Gurion, who was a leader that a nation has once every 1,000 years. And it was well organized, well supported by the United States Jews, who helped them with a lot of money. And eventually, the war ended as it happened. 8 years later, we had I would say, the only planned war that ever been, where we first planned the political side and then opened the war. And I'm talking about the Sinai Desert War, 56. Was planned. I'm not sure that it was the greatest idea, but it was planned together with the French and the British. And then we over-succeeded in the war, and instead of penetrating into Sinai Desert, we find ourselves on Suez Canal, and the rest is, well known. And then the Six-Day War. Now, in the Six-Day War, in 6 days, we took over all the area. And after that, we were surprised by the Syrians and Egyptians in the 73 war. But the 73 war, although we lost almost 3,000 soldiers, was ended not 101 kilometers from Tel Aviv. It was ended 101 kilometers from Cairo. And that was the junction, to my understanding, that was created in the 70s and the beginning of 80s. One branch in the Arab world understood that it's not a good idea to fight Israel. And Egypt went to another direction, which I really expect and want and desire that it will go and be stable. But they went to peace agreements with Israel, the same after another 15 years, the Jordanians, and a lot of, I would say, ceasefire situation with other nations. But at the same time, some Arab nations and Arab people went to another direction. They analyzed the situation, and they understood that in the center of the spectrum of military actions in the so-called conventional war, they cannot defeat Israel, which means they cannot do anything against the Israeli Air Force, the Israeli troops, tanks, and Navy. And then they went to the extreme, to both sides of this crescent, to the right wing, which means unconventional warfare, including missiles and eventually nuclear devices. On the left-hand side, what we call the low-intensive conflict, which means terror, guerrilla, and all the others. And what we are facing now is exactly those two different threats. The problem is that you cannot take off your forces from the center and put them on the sides. And the reason is simple. If you want to have a conventional war, you have to cut the military to 1/3 or half. Eventually, you will get a war. So the best use you can do with a tank is to keep it in the training field. The tank is there. It deters the enemy from creating a war, a conventional war. This is your insurance. But that doesn't mean that you don't have to deal with both sides of the crescent. And if we talk about the different neighbors we have right now, let me say briefly what is the situation in each one of those places. Syria. When the former chief of Air Force, Hafez al-Assad, took over in the 70s, 1970, he had a very severe and cruel war against the Muslim Brothers. And at the beginning of 82, few months before the first Lebanon war, 30,000 people were killed by him in Al-Hama just because of the rebellion they carry against the Syrians. This is three times more than that Bashar al-Assad have done in months. He have done it in few weeks. Then, you know, the war ended, and very, very soon after the war, or actually during the war, the Hezbollah was created. Here, many people remember the beginning of 83, if I'm not mistaken, when the US Marine were attacked by Hezbollah in Lebanon, and many of them got killed, similar to what happened to the French, and before that twice to the Israeli in the same area. And let me say a few words about what happened in Syria right now. I think it's only a question of time, and I don't know how long it will take, that Bashar al-Assad won't be the president and won't be the ruler of Syria. He definitely will be the last Alawi ruler. Whether it's going to take a few months or few years, that's another question. But as destiny, it's already known. Now I see only three options. First of all, a war of attrition that will take a few months or few years. And this won't have a good effect on Israel, of course, because there is a possibility that the Golan Heights will turn to be a no man's land like Sinai Desert. And there is a tradition in the Arab world that when one Arab is fighting another Arab, in order to make peace, they kill a Jew. That's the simple equation. So it's not a good idea. It can happen, and I truly believe that we don't know enough about it. The two other options is, one of them is that we'll get a secular government, a secular ruler. Some people claim liberal ruler. I don't see any secular ruler waiting in Europe or in the United States to take over in Syria. I think that the third option, which I consider to be more reasonable, is a coalition of different extremists and some secular people that will take over, and they will be definitely sooner. Now, in Lebanon, at the same time, the different regimes, different parties are watching very carefully what happened in Syria. And Lebanon is the classic example of a state that no one is managing it and no one is really in charge of it. And this is the old effect of the French mandate that ended somewhere in the 40s, started in the 20s. There are four components, four different regimes and people in Lebanon: the Christian, the Druze, the Muslim, Sunni, and the Shia. Now, during the last generation, I would say, the Shia, leading in the past by Amal, but later on by Hezbollah, are the most prominent force. They were supported by Bashar al-Assad and later on by Hafez al-Assad and later on by Bashar al-Assad. And right now, they are very afraid of the situation in Syria because they understand, first of all, that what you call here the axis of evil, this crescent that starts in Tehran and go to Damascus and then to Beirut is about to collapse. And second, they have very strong enemies inside Lebanon. And those enemies are already creating coalitions. The Druze are talking to the Christians are talking to the Sunni Muslims, and they are altogether about 65 or 70% of the population. And let me remind you that the Shia phenomena is a small one comparing to the Sunni one in the Arab world. Out of 1.5 billion Muslim, only 130 or 140 million are Shia, and most of them around the Gulf, in Iran, Iraq, and other places. So this is an isolated population, and they watch the situation very carefully. Now, what will happen if the Hezbollah is pushed to the corner? No one can predict. There are 50,000 missiles and rockets. They are not about to give up. And whether they will shoot towards Israel or somewhere else, I don't know. But I think they are watching what happened in Syria and get ready for the next phase. If we go to the south and look on Jordan, King Abdullah II is the last, I think, the last king, and that is part of a chain, clan that started in the 20s when Abdullah the First who was the son of Hussein ibn Ali, who was the king of Saudi, who was put in this area by the British because he supported, together with Lawrence of Arabia, he supported the British General Allenby, and he was nominated to be the king. This is the son of his grandson. Now, he is based on 1/3 of the population who are Bedouins, and 2/3 who are Palestinians are not very satisfied with this situation. Out of the 1/3, there is a lot of criticism against the king and against his family. Basically about I would say, the standard of living, economy, and about corruption. And I'm not judging whether it's true or not, but the situation in Jordan, economic situation, is not very good. And after Egypt collapsed, Mubarak is in jail. And after what I expect that will happen in Syria, I'm sure that there is a lot of war in Jordan. And for Israel, it's not good news. We share with the Jordanians a lot of interests, and we really believe that this is a chain that helps the stability in the region. Now to the most important, and I would say the most curious piece in this mosaic, in this puzzle, the Egyptian. The Egyptians are big, proud, and very religious nation. They always did what is good for Egypt and not what is good for the rest. In the 50s, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal because that's what he thought was good for Egypt. Later, President Sadat expelled the Russian consultors and started a war with Israel, 73. And against all the Arab world, he made peace with Israel because he thought it's good for Egypt. Maybe a few years later on, started in 77 and, ended in 81. And don't try to predict according to Western beliefs and in Western eyes what the Egyptians are going to do. They will do what is good for the Egyptians. Now, if you are watching the situation in Egypt, and to those of you that were cheering when the Arab Spring started, I can tell that my understanding is that we are going to face a long and cold winter, not an Arab Spring. Nothing between the European Spring with Garibaldi with red shirts in 150 years ago is comparing to this Arab Spring, not in the values and not in the actions. And among all, when Israel had wars in this region, which the Egyptians were involved in, it always was the major front. 48, 56, of course, they were alone, 67 and 73. And the Egyptians have a very big military force, 1 million soldiers. Half of them reserve, but still 1 million soldiers. Thousands of tanks, a lot of modern equipment. They got billions after the peace agreement every year from the United States, together with Israel. And if you look at this army and you look on their neighbors, they are not going to fight, not Libya and not Sudan. And I'm not saying that the war is on the door, not at all. But look at the situation in Egypt. No Western investment in the next years. Suez Canal is losing a lot of its majority for different reasons. The North Pole, the different size of the ship, and other reasons. No tourism. very low economy and technology. So the next bread riots are on the way. When they will start it, there is no Mubarak to blame anymore. So who are they going to blame? The big Satan and the small Satan. So the big Satan is far away. So I won't be surprised if you will find within a few years that the Egyptians said, in order to protect ourselves, we have to bring some division into the Sinai desert. And let me remind you that a maneuver of Egyptian forces near the Israeli border was among the main reasons to start the war in '67. So hopefully this is not what will happen, but you cannot look at the situation and convince yourself that everything is perfect. Few words about the Palestinians, who are the center stone of the arc in the conflict between Israelis and the Arabs. They are split and fragmented. And it was like this all the years. You have to remember that in '48, those from the city didn't like those from the towns or from the villages. The Christians didn't like the Muslims. The rich didn't like the poor, and Ashashibi didn't like Dajani, and Dajani didn't like Husseini and others. It was always like this. Now we have two different states or entities. In Judah and Samaria, we have a kind of Western culture. You walk in Ramallah, you think you are in Tel Aviv. I was leading a group of friends in Jaffa a week ago. There were 50 Palestinian ladies from Ramallah who came to visit. The relationships are getting closer. The economy situation is better. The tendency towards the Western world is bigger. And this is in one hand. On the other hand, you have Gaza Strip. Look what happened in Gaza Strip. The income per capita is $1,000 a year. These are very radical and very religious people, very poor people. They are well connected to Egypt and not to the Western world, and well connected to the idea of the Muslim Brotherhood. And if you try to analyze why it happened this way, because in '67 the differences were as big as they are now. This is the result of the Israeli action that was a reaction to the Palestinian action. In Gaza, we got only rockets and terror actions and bombs and suicide bombers. So the Israeli action was in the same direction. In the West Bank, there was a big difference. Abu Mazen is a leader of peace. And when he started to lead the Palestinian nation towards peace, the reaction from the Israeli side was in the same manners. As you said here, what goes around comes around. That's exactly what it is. So this is a big problem for the Palestinian people, but it's also a challenge for the Israeli people. We have to decide whether we are going to make agreements with the Palestinian in Judah and Samaria and neglect the Gaza. One, do it together, and it depends who are you asking in Israel. If you ask someone that is in favor of peace, we say that, and another one will say the opposite. Last point out of this puzzle is not a neighbor, but a close country, Iran. It's only 13 to 15, maybe 1,800 kilometers away from Israel. Now, the Persians are the majority in Iran, as you know, 55 or 60%. And 2,500 years ago, the old Persians have their system. The system to control the world. At the time, they were fighting the police cities in Greece, was to create war between those cities, between Atuna and Sparta and between others. Now, the lesson that was learned after the war between the Iraqis and the Iranians in the 80s by the Iranians was that to fight Arabs, it's not a good idea. So let them fight Israel. And they established the Hezbollah, and they supporting the Hamas, and they are supporting the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the PIJ, and they are carrying a lot of operations all over the Middle East, and you know very well what happened in Lebanon to American soldiers, and you know what happened to Israeli embassies in South America, all done and directed from Iran. And at the same time, while this front guard is fighting the Jews and Israelis and Western people all over the world, they are preparing themselves for a different phase, and they are working intensively on creating a nuclear weapon. And I'm watching this issue closely for the last 10 years. Let me put it this way. There wasn't even a single day that their capability was less than it was in the day before. Now the question is, what is the pace? And the pace is affected by the international community, the sanctions, intelligence, cyber warfare. All of these affected the Iranians. But they never woke up in the morning and say, today our capabilities are less than they were yesterday. Never happened in the last 10 years. So it's growing bigger and bigger, and I guess we are very close to the junction of decisions about this issue. Israel. I think Israel, I'm not objective, but if you look at Israel, it's a miracle. If we were sitting in a think tank here 65 years ago with the best experts and professors and try to evaluate what will happen within 65 years, and I'll give you the ingredients. 600,000 Jews, most of them refugees from the Holocaust. A land with no water, semi-desert, no resources, no minerals, and those people are going to face 10 wars and hundreds or thousands of terror actions. So I don't think that there was even one of us that will predict that will have a full democracy with $30,000 GDP per capita that share the values with the Western world. We were thinking about something else, but it happened. Now, in some places, some people think that, you know, this is something that makes Israel to be one of the superpowers in the world. I've been in Harvard about a year ago in a course, and one of the subjects was international economies. And the professor asked a Chinese guy to explain something about the balance between the United States and China. So afterwards, he asked me, what do you think? I said, you know, I'm coming from a small, tiny place. What do you want me to say after the Chinese were talking about the United States? So the Chinese guy stood and said, I want to say something. He said, you are saying that you are from a small place, but we know that you control the world. I said, how come? He said, well, you have all the money, all the bankers, all the politicians, you control the United States. So I think I made a pretty good job and I convinced him. But the problem is that I cannot convince the Israelis that he is wrong. And some Israelis really believe that we are controlling, the world. And we are 0.1% of the world. 6 million out of 6 billion. That's the numbers. Another 6 million Jews here. So 0.2 out of 1%. And we behave like, we are something else. So I know that we have a very good technology systems and we are in the front of biotechnology and agriculture technology, but I think that the Israelis have to be a little bit more humble, but still the life expectancy in Israel is fourth in the world. I don't know if you know that, after I think Switzerland and Japan and some other places. And the satisfaction of the population is among the highest in the world according to the OECD. Now, I'm proud that Israel shares the same values with the liberal countries. I can tell you from my own experience, it's very difficult to keep these values in the front line. When you're a few thousand miles away from the conflict, it's easier. When you're in the conflict, it's very difficult. And I think Israel can be proud of that. And in a way, it's a strong position, a stronghold of the Western world in a hostile place. And this is what we are facing. And as I told you in the beginning, we need the support of the world, of the United States, of Europe, and of Asia and other places. Now, if I'll try to get to some maybe conclusions and some question marks, let me put it this way. Ben-Gurion, the founder of Israel in many ways, said that the future of Israel depends upon two things, two issues. Its might and its justice. As to the might, I believe that the IDF is doing a good job together with all the security organizations. It has to be all the age, all the time, and we are doing it. When I was commanding the Southern Command, it happened to me that I went and saw a young girl, 19 years old, watching through special instruments the Gaza side, and when she had to decide if she see a terrorist that is trying to infiltrate into Israel, she pulled the trigger, and from a far distance, she killed this terrorist. She is 19 years old, she finished high school. But all this system was truly designed by her father, who was working in Rafael, which is one of the military industries. So this combination of technology and I would say the enthusiastic use create a lot. And we have to keep ourselves on the edge. But the most prominent and difficult question is how to keep Israel just. And justice is not just making justice, it's also how you market it. And it turned to be very difficult in the last years. I believe that we have an opportunity now, because after the world is watching the Syrian people killing the Syrian people, Bashar al-Assad by himself killed more Arabs, civilian Arabs, than the IDF killed in 60 years, including whatever you can think about it. In Gaza, in the West Bank, in Lebanon, and the world is quiet. So we have to use this opportunity. Second, I believe that we have to be more humble, more solid, to pay more respect to other people and also to the people underneath us. It took me a long period of time to convince Israeli commanders that they won't be always leading according to their belief and pay respect to the young generation, because the good ideas arise from these people. And when I didn't succeed to convince them, I used to tell them this story. I tell them a man is walking into a store, and he wants to buy a parrot, a talking parrot. So he asked the guy in the shop, how much is this parrot? He said, this one is $1,000. I say, $1,000? Why? He said, he knows how to talk and he also answered the phone. So I say, okay, give me the other one. He said, this other one is $2,000. He said, why $2,000? I say, he knows how to talk, he answered the phone, he typed the computer. I say, okay, forget this one. Give me the last smallest one in the end. He said, this one is $10,000. Say, what does he know to do? He say nothing. So he say, why that? He said, the other two call him sir and consult with him. So if you are humble enough, you understand that once you are in the position, that doesn't mean that you know better than others, and it's good for all the levels. We have to understand, to my belief, that in one hand, we have to search, to look for peace in the next day, but on the other hand, to understand that it may take many years and generations. My father was a combat soldier who arrived in Israel as a volunteer in 1947. When I went to the military, my mom said, you are the last generation to fight. My son just got released after being a combat officer, and my daughter is still a combat soldier in the military, and I don't see why it's going to end within a year or 2 or 3. And we always have this feeling that once we enter the arena is changing because we are smarter, stronger, and we know what to do. So in one hand, it's good to have this hope and to do whatever is possible in order to achieve peace. On the other hand, we have to prepare ourselves to a situation that this is a lasting problem and struggle that won't be ended in the next generations. Time is not working for us anywhere. It's not working for us in Judah and Samaria because the population are getting closer and closer and the problems are getting bigger. It's not working for us in Syria because the vacuum of the the vacuum in the opposition side is going to be filled by radical Muslims. And we see already Al-Qaeda involved. We see already Hamas and the Muslim brothers with their interests. And if the world will not act very fast, if it will take another year or 2 years, eventually we'll find some, I would say, very extremist people in the other side. I think as a last point, what was always the problem of the Jews was that they were fragmented and fighting each other in different ways. And we have to keep unification. United. We have to keep united if we want to exist in this part of the world, because all the catastrophic situation for the Jewish people happened when they weren't united. So this complete my words, my speech. Thank you.
Yoav, thank you very much. You covered a lot of ground, and there's lots of issues that we can pick up. I'd like to open up a discussion session and ask you, given the picture you just painted, not a very happy picture for Israel, is there anything Israel can do to change the picture other than pursue peace as much as possible, which is something you did cite, but to be even more specific, on any of the issues around you, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Iran, Palestinians, is there anything that Israel can do to change the environment, to make the environment either less threatening or more conducive to your security?
I truly believe that a better economical and political horizon in the Palestinian side is an Israeli interest. If the situation will be better in the Palestinian side, it will affect positively the Israeli side. And as I told you, this is the centerpiece of this problem, this arc. So the sooner we'll get to a solution, no matter what this solution is, with the Palestinians, the better is for Israel. And this is not an easy issue. It's not an easy issue. If you watch what happened during the last 100 years, the Peel Committee, if you're familiar with this name, in the 30s, 37, 38, offered the Palestinians 70%, the Jews 20%, and 10% of the land in international mandate. They rejected it. 10 years later, the UN resolution was 55% for the Palestinians, 40% for the Jews, 5% international mandate. They rejected it and opened a war. So nowadays they can only dream about this proportion, but still we have to make some kind of agreement. It's good for them, and I believe it's good for us. And this is in our backyard. As to other issues, I think that you said I'm paddling in the sea. So, you know, you can paddle a kayak, but to paddle a U.S. carrier with a very small paddle, it's not easy. So we have to understand that this massive phenomena in the Arab world are done without a real connection to us. This is the population over there that want to have different life.
Thank you. Open the floor to your questions. Yes. First here. Can you take the mic who's working its way over? And thank you.
General Galant, thank you very much. My name is Albert Nikemkin. As a follow-up to Rob's question, I wonder if you could comment on the settlements. You didn't mention them at all. What do you see as the influence of the settlements in the area or the arena as you gave a survey? And in the context of, is there anything Israel can do to improve the situation?
You know, I try to base my words, my views, my estimations on my background and my knowledge. And I am on the military side. I was raised in military background, and not on a political one. And therefore, I don't think it's a good idea that I will give explanation about these issues. But there is a big debate in Israel that started when Zionism started, whether we have to expand or whether we have to stay in the place we are staying. And I believe that all these puzzles have to be solved simultaneously, which means once you achieve what you want with the Palestinians, then you can do also compromises about certain issues. And by saying achieve, I mean the finalization of the conflict, I mean water, I mean safe borders and other issues. If you achieve that, on the other hand, you can give certain issues, but the idea is to try to balance our interest according to our necessities, and that's about it.
I'm going to take this question and turn it in a little different direction, if I can. As I said in my introduction, you saw both ends of the disengagement, both the strategic decision-making and the operational impact. Now that we're years past this experience, what is your assessment? Did it achieve what Ariel Sharon hoped it would have achieved?
I can analyze it from a military point of view. And there are, I would say, upsides and downsides from the military point of view. The first upside is that you have clean and short borders, which means it's easier to defend the Israeli population in the south, for sure. It's not easy to defend hundreds of cars, buses, and settlers inside hostile places. On the other hand, the mass buildup of military power in Gaza Strip is growing every day. And it was similar when we have been to Gaza, but we have a better control of the situation. Nowadays, the border between Sinai and Egypt is totally open through tunnels and different other channels. And we are gathering a different situation in the Gaza Strip. And there is some understanding in some places in the world, in the Arab world, that after Israel withdrew from Lebanon and from Gaza, this is a sequence that they can use to their benefits in other places, like West Bank and other places. So it's, in a way, it's balance. If you talk in general about Gaza Strip, we have, as Israelis, we have only three interests in Gaza Strip. We want peace and quiet situation in the Gaza area. We want the area to be neutralized from weapons, ammunition, dismantling the area. And we don't want to be responsible this way or another to Gaza Strip. The problem is that the relationship between those three different targets are like in the game a stone, a paper, and trousers. Each one is able to hit the other one, but can be hit by another one. So if you want quiet and peace, you cease fire, but the control over the weapons and ammunition is impossible. Mm-hmm. If you try to control, you are responsible, and so forth and so on. So we are doing what the Israeli love to do is, sit and wait. And while sitting and waiting, it's because the Israeli people and the Israeli governments, all of them, are addicted to peace, addicted to quiet. And if you are addicted, the order of preference is changed. So you are willing to pay a lot for one day of quiet life, or 1 month or 1 year. But we see what's going on the other side. So it's not the best situation, but I believe that we deter them. And the situation in Gaza, in a way, it turned to be very similar to the one in Lebanon. The option and the capability is there, but they are deterred by the IDF from action. So what we are going to face in I would say, the next years is less friction, but every time that something erupts, it will be in a high amplitude. That's basically what will happen, to my understanding, similar to Lebanon, which in the eyes of Israel is much better than the situation that was before.
Gil and then Yoram.
Gil Tamari, Channel 10, Israel, retired General Galant. In a world without the Arpaz affair, today you are in your second year as the Commander-Chief of Staff of the IDF. In light of the latest testimonies that was published just a week ago from the Lindenstrauss report and investigation, I wonder to know, how do you see this entire issue now, almost more than a year after it happened to you?
I arrive in here to speak about strategic issue.
But still, it's
the
relevant
facts,
and interesting.
let me put it this way. The facts are exposed and well known. We are having a little amount of journalists like Zeev Schiff that can expose what happened, and we are missing those people. I believe that it will be well known to the population eventually.
And how do you feel it? How do you feel about it personally?
I said what I want.
Thank you.
Yoram.
Yoram Perry from the University of Maryland. We are commemorating these days 30th year of the war in Lebanon. Zeev Schiff was one of 4 or 5 journalists who tried for a year to prevent that war, arguing that the tradition of Israel is to go to war only when there are preemptive strikes and not preventive war. And indeed, the results of the war in Lebanon show that he was right, like some others, including Ehud Yaari, who is another fellow here. Do you think that we should continue to keep the same tradition of going to just wars, or to go to wars only when they are considered just wars, namely as a preemptive strike, or should we change it and use it also when it is preventive war? And I'm talking about the case which is on the desk of every decision maker in Israel today. Thank you.
The major change that happened in the history of the Israeli Defense Forces, in the thinking of them, happened at the beginning of 48. Till then, we have all the organizations that were having the names of Hashomer, the guard, or Hagana, the defense. And the idea was how to protect settlements, roads, and whatever. What happened in 48? I don't know if you are familiar with what's called the Nachshon operation. What is the Nachshon operation and why it was a difference and how it connected to your question? Ben-Gurion told the Yigal Yadin, who was second in command to the chief of staff, make sure that Jerusalem will not fall. So he said, I have 500 soldiers ready. He said, I didn't ask you for 500 soldiers, bring 5,000. So he said, if I'll bring 5,000, all the fronts will collapse. So Ben-Gurion said, if Jerusalem will fall, everything will fall. Bring 5,000. So, he came back to the headquarters and said, the old man don't know anything, but he obeyed the order. Then you have 3 or 4 brigades. And what happened is that instead of breaching the different obstacles on the road, they took over by offensive step all the villages and all the strongholds of the enemy. And when the convoy was on the way to Jerusalem, there was no enemy to interfere. This shaped the idea of the IDF that say strategically we are defending. Tactically, we are taking. Why we are taking tactically? In order to defend. That's the basic idea. That's how we keep the initiative in our hands. Now, the only question is the translation and the degree you take this idea towards the next phases. So I said in advance to Rob, and I'm telling you, I feel too much connected and too responsible to say something about this issue that too many things have been said about it already. Maybe too much. And I truly believe that this is an Israeli interest, this is an international interest, and the solution will arise this way or another, hopefully.
We'll take from Natan and Jess in the back. If you can both ask your questions along with Jacques, and then we'll bring it to a close.
Thank you. Natan Sachs from Brookings. General Galant, you mentioned the no man's land in Sinai, and given your vast experience in the Southern Command, I was wondering, what do you think are the potential pitfalls in security relations in the Sinai, and what kind of events might cause the IDF to cross the border or to reach the border, like we saw just before the embassy event in Cairo, which of course could have strategic ramifications?
Okay. Jess?
General Galant, you said at the end of your remarks that time is not working in Israel's favor, and you mentioned the West Bank as your first example. But earlier, you described a rather hopeful situation in the West Bank. You said that they were turning towards the West, and that there were people-to-people exchanges. So that seems to suggest that time is working in Israel's favor with regard to the West Bank. So I'm a little confused.
And lastly, in front.
Jacques Romani, on a strategic question, what do you consider to be the minimum defensible borders on the West Bank in the case of a settlement with the Palestinians? Thank you.
Simple question.
As to the first question about Sinai Desert, what created the problem in Sinai Desert is the feeling of the Bedouin population. Basically, the standard of living in Egypt broke the government in former years to bring many people from all over Egypt, from Cairo, from Alexandria, from Port Said, to Sinai Desert in order to, make a living out of the tourism and some other issues. Now, the Bedouins were pushed to the corner. When they were pushed to the corner, they started to smuggle goods, drugs, women's and ammunition. And eventually they find themselves organized as a gang that is under the law. I would put it this way: they don't have rights and they don't have obligations towards the Egyptian side. And therefore, it is a big issue. It is in the capabilities of the Egyptian to deal with this problem. And I believe that if they will decide to do it, they will. And as to the Israeli action, I don't think that it will be reasonable or it will be done this way or another. I don't think that this is an option that anyone is evaluate as a real option. I'm familiar with the different sayings in the Egyptian elections about what Israel will do. But, this is said by same people who said no matter how many voters we have, it depends who count the votes, okay? These pretty much the same people. So it's done for internal issues. I don't think that Israel is going to risk the peace agreement and the military annex to the peace agreement with the Egyptians this way or another. And this is an internal issue for the Egyptian to solve it. As to the next question about the settlements, about
Question of time.
yeah, let me put it this way. If you enjoy the interest of the money you have in the bank, it's nice. Once you take the money out for a temporary period of time, you have a lot, but then you are broken. So if you will, if you use it for too long, eventually this source will get dry. And this is a temporary situation because we build some relationship, but all of the relationship that are built over there is in a projection and in a fate that eventually a political solution will arrive. So this is, in a way, this is what the people are doing at the meantime. And therefore, it can last 10 years, 15 years, but you need a political solution and not just economical solution. And as to the borders, well, if you look to the eastern side of Israel, and there is not too many layers between Jerusalem and Tehran. I mean, it's only 1,500 kilometers, and in the middle you have Iran, Iraq, the Kingdom of Jordan, who is friendly and have a peace agreement with Israel, and then the Jordan Valley, which is part of the West Bank of the Jordan, and the West Bank. Now, as you well know, the distance between some places in Judah and Samaria and the coast is 10 miles. Even not 10 nautical miles, 10 miles. And this is it. So it's very much depend on the status and I would say the configuration of the Palestinian state to be established. It is, in my understanding, no matter if it will be established as an entity or a state, it have to be dismantled from serious military capabilities. No other way. And I'm not talking about rifles and guns. And then you can decide upon the solutions, because it's not a one problem that you have with your enemy from the east, but you have also internal issues to solve, and you have to find the golden path in between those two. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me just, Jacques' last question was itself the topic of a study that Zeev did for us, security requirements and a final peace settlement between Israel and the Palestinians. And in one sentence, that was exactly Zeev's answer, which was the requirements are not independent of the nature of the agreement, that the nature of the agreement determines the requirements, not just some line on the map. General Galant said that he's a military man not to talk about political issues. On Tuesday afternoon, a political man who used to be a military man, Shaul Mofaz, will be here to talk about the issues that we didn't talk about. But I'm very delighted that we did spend today's Schiff lecture talking about the strategic overview that you provided. General Galant, thank you very much for being here. Sarah, Eyal, and Hadar, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for joining us for this year's Zeev Schiff Memorial Lecture. Thank you.